Chapter 14. Very, very angry. Mary. The people of Israel were trembling with fear, I said. They'd been in the wilderness for months now. I was telling Abigail and Nathan the story of how our people became God's people, of how he had rescued the descendants of Abraham from slavery in Egypt all those centuries ago and brought them into their own land. We would tell the story properly in a few weeks' time, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when we'd build a shelter outside to remember the shelter God gave our people in those days. But there was no harm in telling it now, too. In fact, it did a lot of good, to me at least. It was good to think about something other than the baby and Joseph, and Joseph's ma. God had defeated the Egyptians, I said, and allowed the Israelites to escape. He showed them the way, gave them food, and made salty water drinkable so they wouldn't get thirsty. There was miracle after miracle, but the people were still afraid. "Stupid," shouted Nathan. "But the wilderness was horrible," Abigail pointed out. She shivered. I would have been scared too. "He gave them fire from heaven," retorted Nathan, "and bread from the sky." And, I added, he told them that they were his people, and he was their God. "And he promised them a new place to live," said my brother. "That's right." Abigail pursed her lips, not wanting Nathan to have it all his own way. But they didn't get there for ages. I nodded. Shall I tell you why? I put down the palm fronds I was twisting into a braid. We were making decorations ready for the Feast of Tabernacles, and stretched out my legs. I never seemed to be able to get comfy anymore. They had reached a mountain called Sinai, I began. Moses, who was the leader, went up to the top where God spoke to him. The rest of the people stayed at the bottom. They watched and waited for Moses to return. "They just stood there looking at the mountain?" asked Nathan quizzically. "Well," I said, "no, I don't know how long they actually stood there looking. I guess they had other things to do. But they did stay at the bottom of the mountain. They stayed there for a really long time." "How long?" "Moses was gone for 40 days and 40 nights. And during that time, all they could see was a glinting fire far away on the top of the mountain. Everything was silent, and they were afraid. Afraid of God. Afraid that God wasn't there, and Moses had disappeared, and they were on their own." Nathan scoffed, but his eyes were round, and the long palm leaves he'd been plaiting lay forgotten. "So they decided to make their own God." "What?" "They gathered up all the gold and jewelry they had and they melted it down. Then they took clay and made an enormous mold. Then they poured the gold into the mold and left it to cool. And in the morning they broke the clay to reveal a shining golden calf." "A calf?" said Nathan disbelievingly. "A baby cow," Abigail told him. He glared. "I know." Then they told each other that the calf was a god, and that it had rescued them out of Egypt. I paused. Nathan muttered that this was stupid. "Yes," I said, "but it wasn't just stupid. It was a terrible thing to do. They turned their backs on the God who loved them and worshipped something else instead." "They were like an unfaithful wife," Abigail said suddenly. The world went silent and still. All I could hear was my heart. Thud, thud. I stared at Abby. "What did you say?" "They were like an unfaithful wife," she repeated cheerfully. "Someone who lies and cheats and loves somebody else instead of her husband." "And," I stuttered, "and where have you heard about unfaithful wives?" She shrugged. "Ma?" I took a few deep breaths. "Then what happened?" Nathan asked impatiently. "Then," I replied, recovering, "God was very angry with them." I couldn't help it. I immediately thought about Joseph. I had not seen him since his mother had hit me in the face, but I could imagine his anger. As far as Joseph knew, I had betrayed his trust completely, just as the Israelites had betrayed the Lord God. How could he forgive me for that? Would he even be willing to hear me explain myself? My mother certainly wasn't. So far, she was the only person Joseph's mother had told. I think they were hoping that Joseph might admit to being the father of the baby. If he did, we might still get married. And while that was a possibility, they didn't want to disgrace me in front of the whole village. But they were both very, very angry, and they did not have any interest at all in hearing me explain. There was anger everywhere, it seemed, even though we were supposed to be in a season of celebration. My older brother was in big trouble again. He'd been found weaving his way around Sepphoris, wine bottle in hand, shouting insults about King Herod. I had never seen my father look more angry than when he saw Reuben being dragged into the village by the pair of soldiers who'd arrested him. "You had a fresh start," he raged, after they told him what Reuben had been doing. His face was purple and his throat clogged with anger. "Joanna was full of how well behaved you were in Judea. I was all ready to welcome you back and start again, but you can't keep yourself out of trouble, can you?" Then it got worse. The soldiers happened to mention that Reuben had been seen in a Roman temple praying to a foreign god. When he heard this, my father fell silent and his lips became very thin. The soldiers exchanged glances and left in a hurry. The yelling started again immediately afterwards. "Are you a son of mine or not?" my father cried again and again. "Are you a child of Abraham or not?" He wanted to throw Reuben out and never see him again, but Ma persuaded him otherwise. Reuben would stay, but he was not allowed out of the house until the Day of Atonement was over. That was in 11 days' time. On the Day of Atonement, she said, you will ask God for forgiveness and hope that he allows you a fresh start. Again, snorted my father. But when it came to me, my mother didn't even mention the possibility of forgiveness. I sighed, twisting the braided palm fronds between my fingers. My mother was wrong to be angry at me. But God was right to be angry at the people who made that golden calf. They had done a terrible thing, and it hadn't even been the first time they'd betrayed his trust. Yet the Lord had not stayed angry forever. After that, God told the Israelites once again that they would be his people and he would be their God, I told Nathan and Abigail. He didn't let them go to the land he'd promised them straight away, but he did keep on providing what they needed, and eventually his people made it to their new home. I wouldn't have forgiven them, said Nathan archly. They didn't deserve it. No, I agreed, but that's why it's a good thing you're not God. I stood up. Festival season starts tomorrow, I said in my most cheerful voice. The Day of Trumpets first, and then the Day of Atonement. And then Tabernacles, they shouted in unison. They rushed inside, full of excitement. I grinned after them. But when they'd gone, the smile left my face. It felt like someone had blown out a lamp and I was alone in the dark. The thud went my heart. The thud. It sounded like anger and pain.